The sky was pale as bone, drained of color, wide and watching. Wind dragged across the empty street like something wounded, slow, gritty, pulling dust in long, curling tendrils across the cracked boards of the porch where she stood. Her dress clung to her legs in stiff folds, heavy from the road and damp at the hem with melted frost. One child hung from her hip, cheeks hollow with cold, the other clung to her skirt with both hands and did not speak. Behind her, the wagon sat like a broken thing, lopsided and splintered, one wheel angled wrong. A horse gone lame, the reins dangling loose in the dust. She had come looking for something. Not charity, she would never call it that, but something close to mercy. What she met instead was a town with shuttered windows and turned backs. The blacksmith had looked up once, then went back to hammering. The woman behind the store counter kept wiping the same patch of wood, slow and deliberate, not meeting her eyes. Her throat was raw from asking for food, for help, for work, anything. They had looked at her children, then at her, and looked away. She had stopped asking an hour ago. The boy coughed, a dry little sound that cut deeper than hunger. Her arm trembled under the weight of the toddler, no heavier than a sack of feed, though he should have been. Her fingers were going numb. Then, out past the edge of town, someone moved. He stood by the hitching post outside the saloon, a tall man with a brimmed hat low over his brow and the rough shoulders of someone who'd lived close to the land. He had not looked up during the worst of it, had not turned when she stumbled in front of the livery, begging with her eyes more than her mouth. But now he did. His gaze caught hers like a rope pulling tight. He didn't look away. The girl at her skirts pulled at her hand. "Mama," she whispered. The man stepped off the boardwalk. His boots made no sound she could hear, not over the thudding in her chest. He came slow, hands loose at his sides, a small limp in his left leg like an old wound that still spoke in winter. When he reached her, he didn't ask her name. Didn't ask where her husband was or what she thought she was doing out here with no place to go. Instead, he looked at the children. Really looked. Then took off his coat. "Put this on him," he said, voice low and dry like creek stones under shallow water. He held out the coat for the boy. She didn't move at first. The cold had made her slower. Or maybe it was that no one had spoken to her like she mattered in two whole towns. The man crouched and held the coat open. "Go on now," he said gently to the child this time. The boy's small hands crept forward. When the coat swallowed him up, he gave the smallest of smiles. The man stood again and looked at her. There was something in his face that wasn't pity. She could have borne pity. This was something else. "I got some beans on the stove," he said. "A little cornbread left from last night. Ain't much, but it's hot." Still she hesitated. He saw it. That worry curled in part of her that had been knocked loose too many times. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, "or take nothing from you. But the wind's picking up and they need to eat. You do too." She searched his face for a catch, for some sign he was like the others. But the boy had already tugged her hand, following the coat. And so she nodded once, knees trembling, and followed. As they passed the saloon, no one spoke. A man inside spat tobacco and turned his chair toward the fire. Behind them, the wind rose up again and scattered dust where they had stood. His place sat just outside the edge of town, past the split-rail fence that marked the last boundary anyone seemed to care about. It wasn't much. One room, a lean-to off the side for firewood, and a rusted pump that groaned like an old man, but smoke came from the chimney, and the porch boards held steady underfoot. She stepped inside and felt heat move over her like something living. Not enough to thaw all the way, but enough to loosen her spine. The boy dropped the coat and made for the stove with cautious awe. The girl stayed at her side. The man moved without talk, took down bowls, cut slices from the cornbread, poured beans from a pot that still let off slow steam. His motions were quiet, practiced. He set the bowls on the table without looking for thanks. She helped the children up to the bench, steadying their small arms. They ate without speaking, too hungry for manners. The girl's eyes brimmed, whether from the heat or the food she couldn't say. The man poured 2 more bowls and set one in front of her. He took the other and sat across from her, eating slow, chewing like he'd known the edge of hunger once too. When she didn't touch hers, he didn't push. After a while he said, "What happened to your horse?" "Stepped in a hole," she said, voice brittle. "Rolled his leg. Couldn't walk. I had to shoot him." He didn't say he was sorry. Just nodded like it was the kind of thing that needed no apology. "You got folks?" he asked after a time. "No," she said. He waited. "My husband died last year. Kansas fever. We tried to hold the farm. Couldn't. Then the banker came. Took what was left." "Too many stories like that," he said. She looked at the scar across his knuckles, the nick in his ear. "Small marks of survival." "You got folks?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." Silence settled again. Not heavy. Just there, like a second skin. After the children finished, he brought them an old quilt, faded and patched but warm. They curled on the bed without protest, too tired to care that it wasn't theirs. The boy fell asleep first, his mouth slightly open. The girl clutched her brother's side, her lashes still wet. She stood back from the bed, arms crossed over her middle, her shoulders pulled tight. "I can sleep on the floor," she said. He raised his brow. "Ain't necessary. I'll take the lean-to. Wind don't bite as hard when you know it's only for a night." "I don't want—" He shook his head. "I'm not asking. You've had enough taken from you." She didn't thank him. Couldn't. The words stuck. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, steady and slow. The kind that got into your bones and stayed there. But inside, the stove crackled and her feet began to remember what warmth felt like. She stood there a long time after he went out, watching her children sleep, listening to the wind, the stove, and the quiet of a place that had offered nothing but one man who didn't look away. She sat down at the table, broke a piece of cornbread, ate it slowly, savoring the salt and the silence. It was the first time she'd tasted anything in weeks. Ride deeper. Subscribe for more stories from the edge. Snow came in the night, quiet as breath. By morning, the world outside was hushed in white fences, half lost beneath the drift, the road to town covered clean. She stood at the window in the man's coat, her fingers warming inside its sleeves, watching the pale light shift across the hills. The children still slept. She'd tucked them in deeper sometime before dawn, after waking cold and startled from a dream she couldn't remember. She heard him before she saw him, boots on the steps, then the scrape of the door opening. He stamped the snow off, carrying in a split bundle of wood under one arm. "You got snow on your hat," she said. He grinned, slow and crooked. "That's how I know it's still winter." He set the wood down by the stove and started feeding it piece by piece into the flame. "Fire needs tending regular in this kind of cold. Gonna be worse tomorrow, I expect. I should be gone before then." "You can't pull that wagon through snow," he said, matter of fact. "Not with a bad wheel. Not with children." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not asking for charity. I didn't offer any." She turned, arms crossed tight. "Then what would you call it?" He stood and dusted off his hands. "I call it not turning away from folks who need help. Town might have the luxury to ignore you, but I don't." She didn't answer. The window was fogging over from the heat of the stove. She ran a sleeve across the glass, clearing a small circle. Outside, the wind had settled. Everything looked still, like a photograph waiting to be taken. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Then Clara." He nodded. "Samuel." That was it. No last names, no questions, just the exchange of two truths in a room full of silence and warming wood. The children stirred one after the other, small sounds of waking hunger. Samuel pulled down a tin of oats and reached for the tin cup beside the water barrel. "I can do that," Clara said, moving forward. He let her, stepping back as she measured the oats into the pot. Her hands were steadier today. The shaking had mostly stopped. He handed her a small jar. "Molasses. A little helps." She didn't thank him, just nodded. The oats simmered, thickening. The children came to the table with yawns and pink cheeks, and for a moment the cabin felt almost like a place where families belong. Later, after breakfast, Samuel took the boy out to gather kindling, letting the child trail behind him with a too big bundle in his arms, and a grin so wide it made Clara's throat ache. She sat on the porch steps mending a torn sleeve with thread Samuel had pulled from a drawer. The girl leaned against her, humming low. "How long you been out on the road?" Samuel asked when he came back. "Since October. Been through 3 towns. One of them burned." She didn't explain more. Didn't need to. He crouched beside the sled they'd packed with wood, checking the runners. "You could stay. Just until the road clears. I've got room. Enough food for a week if we stretch it." She didn't answer right away. Her pride twisted up like a knot inside her. "I'll help," she said finally. "Cook, clean, mend, and I know work." He nodded once. "Then we'll call it work." That night, after the children were asleep, she sat by the stove while Samuel cleaned his rifle by lamplight. Not for hunting, just habit. She watched the way his hands moved, careful, and practiced the way a man moved when he'd known danger but no longer flinched from it. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked. "Army. Before I got tired of men telling me where to point it." She half smiled. "You kill anyone." He looked at her, not startled, not angry. "Too many to count. And one I still regret." Silence fell again, but it wasn't empty. "I had a sister," he said after a while. "Ran off with a traveling man. He left her with a baby and no way home. She died in the cold before I could find her. That's why I didn't look away." Clara looked down at her hands. "And if I hadn't been here, I reckon I'd still have helped," he said. "But maybe not so quick." The fire cracked. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the snow kept falling. The days settled into rhythm. Not easy, nothing was easy, but solid, like the beat of a drum or the swing of an axe. Clara rose before dawn, stirred the stove to life, made bread with what little flour remained. Samuel saw to the animals, chopped wood, hauled snow to melt for water. The children played in the barn when the cold let up their laughter, small and strange in that empty stretch of land. She found herself watching him more than she meant to. Not for fear she'd lived under the weight of men before, had learned to read their silences the way anger could live in their breath. But Samuel was different. Quiet in a way that wasn't mean. He never raised his voice. Never looked at her like she owed him for the roof or the fire or the second bowl of stew. He listened when she spoke. That more than anything unsettled her. One morning, as she scrubbed the washboard in a basin of half-warm water, she caught him watching her from the doorway. His coat was dusted with snow, and the brim of his hat dripped slow droplets down the collar. She straightened water, freezing her raw hands. Something wrong. He stepped inside, shook off the cold. "No, just wondered how a woman like you ended up this far west." Clara squeezed out the rag and laid it flat. "Same reason as everyone else, I guess. Thought there might be something better." His jaw worked for a second like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. Just picked up the bucket and carried it out, leaving her alone with the steam and the sound of water dripping slow onto the floorboard. That night after supper, the children fell asleep before the lamp burned low. Clara sat by the fire, her fingers wrapped around a tin cup of tea. Samuel sat beside her, not close enough to touch, but not far either. "I should be scared," she said suddenly. "You could be anybody." and I'm here with nothing. You should be scared, he agreed. But you're not. She looked over at him. Why not? He took a long time to answer. Because you've been through worse. And you're still standing. She let out a breath. It wasn't a laugh, not quite, but it felt like one that got halfway there before turning into something else. Then he said, I found a pair of boots behind the stove. Child's size. Figured they were your boys. She nodded. I didn't want to ask. You didn't have to. The silence after that felt warm. Not comfortable, but not empty either. Another storm came 2 days later. Wind like a whip ice in the corners of the windows, the world outside gone to white. They stayed in rationed food. Samuel carved a wooden horse for the boy who clutched it like treasure. The girl sat close to Clara while she sewed a button back onto a coat sleeve. In the quiet, the truth of what they were building began to settle around them. Not love, not yet, but something older. Respect. Shelter. The slow blooming of trust between two people who'd known too much cold. One night, Clara stepped outside while the others slept. The sky was clear for the first time in days. Stars sharp as needles. The snow glowed blue under the moonlight. She heard the door open behind her, then close again. Samuel stood beside her, quiet. You miss them? She asked. He nodded. Every day. She looked up at the stars, then down at the long stretch of white beyond the fence. I don't miss the life I had, just what I hoped it might turn into. He looked at her then, really looked, and said maybe there's still time for that. They stood there until the cold crept into their bones, but neither of them moved. The thaw came slow. First in the air, the way it lost its bite around noon, then in the earth, where ice loosened its grip on the roots, and the wagon ruts showed through again in long, wet scars. By the time the snow had started pulling back from the fence line, Samuel had repaired the broken wagon wheel and oiled the harness, though he hadn't said a word about it. Clara knew what it meant. The road would be passable soon, and she would have to choose. She said nothing for days. Instead, she buried herself in work. She cleaned the chimney, mended the loose drawer in the table, patched the elbows of Samuel's shirt. He watched her in quiet pieces, as if trying to read something she wasn't saying out loud. The children were stronger now. Their cheeks had filled in, and their eyes had lost that far-off glaze of hunger. The boy ran from the barn each evening with straw in his hair and a story tumbling out of his mouth. The girl followed Clara everywhere, her hand seeking hers without looking. Clara started walking the road in the mornings. Not far, just to the bend where the trees thinned and the wind cut across the land a little harsher. She told herself it was to clear her head, but it was also where the choice waited. One morning Samuel joined her. He didn't say anything for a long while, just walked beside her slow and steady. I finished the wagon, he said eventually. Fixed the harness too. She nodded. I figured you could leave tomorrow, maybe even today if you wanted. She didn't answer. They stood at the bend. Beyond it, the land stretched out wide and empty the way it had looked the day she arrived. The road held no promises, only the weight of movement, of survival, of more towns that might turn their backs. You didn't have to fix it, she said. I know. Then why did you? Because I wanted you to have a choice. The wind moved through the trees. Clara's hair came loose from its pins. She didn't fix it. I ain't got much, he said. But I can give you and the kids a roof. Work. A safe place. You wouldn't owe me anything. She turned to him slowly. That sounds like an offer. He gave her a small, tired smile. It is. They walked back in silence. The kind of silence that carried things, hope, maybe, or fear. That evening, after the children were asleep, Clara stood by the fire, twisting the hem of her apron in her hands. When I left Kansas, she said, I didn't think I'd ever stop running. I figured that's all there was now, movement. Loss. Samuel looked up from where he sat sharpening a blade. But when we got here and the snow came in and we stayed, I started hoping. Just a little. He said nothing. Just waited. I don't know what it means, she whispered. To stop. To stay. It means you don't have to do it alone. Her throat tightened. Her hands fell still. The next morning, she didn't walk to the bend. She made breakfast instead, set 4 bowls on the table. The children came running. Samuel joined them, quiet and calm, same as always. After the meal, Clara stepped outside. The snow was melting in slow rivers along the edges of the house. The wagon sat beside the barn ready, but she didn't go to it. She walked to the porch rail, laid her hand on the wood. Behind her, Samuel opened the door and leaned against the frame. You made a choice? He asked. She turned to him. The morning light caught in her eyes. I think I already did. Spring came in patches, first the sound of water under the crust of snow, then the smell of thawed earth rising rich and dark. The children took to the fields like deer loosed from fences, laughing in a way Clara hadn't heard since before grief set its teeth in her. Inside the cabin, things changed quietly. She began putting her needle and thread beside Samuel's tools on the shelf not tucked away. Her bread started to rise better in the warmer air, and he asked for seconds without shame. At night, after the fire was banked, they sat at the table and talked in low voices while the children slept just a few feet away, of nothing and everything. Of weather and memory. Of the time he'd broken his arm falling off a wild horse. Of her first sewing lesson at 9 years old. They didn't speak of the past that still hurt. Some truths stayed folded. One evening, after she laid the children down, she came back to the table to find Samuel holding something in his hand. A small carved figure, an animal, maybe a fox, shaped smooth by hours of work. For the girl, he said without looking up. She always picks flowers like she wants to keep them. Clara reached out, touched the soft grain of it with one finger. She will love this. Samuel's voice was low. She's got her mother's eyes. The words caught her. Gentle, simple, but they landed hard. She didn't speak for a while. Just sat down across from him. You think this lasts? She asked finally. Any of it? I don't know, he said. But I know I want to find out. They didn't touch. Not yet. But the space between them felt full, like something blooming. A week later, a rider came down the road. Dusty, lean, wearing a coat with a badge tucked just beneath the flap. He asked for Clara by name. She stepped outside, heart hammering. Samuel stood behind her. Your late husband's brother, the man said. Filed a claim. Wants the children. Says you're not fit. Says you ran. Clara went still. The world tilted, the light shifted, and her breath hitched like a horse pulling up too hard. Samuel stepped forward, slow and calm. She's not running anymore, he said. The rider looked between them, shrugged. Judge won't care much what she's doing. Just what the papers say. You'll have to answer. Clara nodded once. When? 2 weeks. Town courthouse. That night, after the children slept, Clara sat outside on the porch. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears a long time ago. But her hands shook. Samuel came and stood beside her. I'll come with you, he said. It won't matter, she whispered. Blood always matters more to men like that. He knelt beside her, hand close but not touching. Then we'll fight the way we can. With truth. With folks who've seen you here. With what you've built. She looked at him. You believe I'll win? He held her gaze. I believe they're your children. And I believe you're not alone. And there it was, that thing she hadn't dared to trust. Not love. Not yet. But something steady. Something true. The next morning she rose before light and began to sew, not for the courthouse, not for show, but for her children, for the home she wanted to keep, for the life they had begun to shape with their hands and their choices. The wind kicked up the morning they rode into town, dry and fast, lifting dust into the air like smoke. Clara sat stiff-backed in the wagon, the children beside her dressed in their best clean shirts, combed hair, faces scrubbed until they shone. Samuel rode ahead on horseback, his coat flapping open, rifle strapped behind him, not to be used but not hidden either. The courthouse sat at the far end of the street, pale stone worn smooth by years of sun and weather. Clara climbed the steps alone, holding her daughter's hand. The boy kept close behind, too quiet for his age. Samuel stayed outside with the wagon hat in hand. Inside the room felt colder than it should have. A judge in wire-rimmed spectacles sat at the bench. Her late husband's brother Frank stood near the front, smug in the way of men who've never been hit hard by life. His lawyer droned on words like irresponsible, wandering, destitute. Clara sat straight and said nothing, her jaw locked tight. Then they called her name. She rose. She didn't shake as she walked to the front. "My husband died in the spring," she said, voice flat. "He was sick a long time. I stayed. I buried him. Then I tried to keep the farm. The bank came for it before the ground thawed. We left with what we had." The lawyer opened his mouth, but she kept going. "I walked behind that wagon more miles than I can count. My boy ran a fever in Missouri. I held him all night, afraid he'd die. My daughter near lost her foot to frostbite in Nebraska. No one helped us. Not until now." She looked at the judge. "We didn't come west to beg. We came to start again. And we have." The judge tapped his pen, unreadable. Frank stepped forward. "She ain't stable. She's living on some man's land like a squatter." Samuel's voice cut through from the doorway. "It's her land now." All heads turned. He stepped forward, calm, steady, holding a folded deed. "I filed this morning," he said. "In her name. The land, the house, the outbuildings. Paid with my own money. She's no squatter." The judge took the paper, adjusted his glasses. "You two married?" Samuel glanced at Clara, then back. "Not yet." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Clara stepped in, voice low but firm. "Because he didn't want to take from me what I didn't offer. He waited. He gave me space to choose." The judge was quiet for a long time. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Then he said, "Children stay with their mother." Case dismissed. Frank cursed under his breath. His lawyer pulled him away by the elbow, whispering fast. Clara stood still until her knees nearly gave. When she turned, Samuel was already walking toward her. She didn't speak, just reached for his hand. He held it tight. They left town just before sundown. The children rode in the back, clutching hands, too young to understand it all but wise enough to feel the relief. Halfway home, Clara looked over at Samuel. "Why'd you really file that deed?" He smiled slow, then said, "Because I want to build something that lasts." She didn't answer, just leaned against his shoulder and let the wind run through her hair. The thaw brought color back to the land, first in patches of grass that pushed through the mud, then in the scatter of wildflowers along the edges of the fields. Birds returned with their high calls, and the days stretched longer, softening into warm dusks where the sky burned orange and gold before slipping into blue. Clara planted a garden behind the cabin. Nothing grand, just rows of potatoes, carrots, a scatter of beans. The children helped, their small fingers eager in the soil. Samuel built a fence around it to keep the mule from wandering through. He did it without being asked, hammering late into the evening, the last nails driven by lantern light. At supper they began to eat by habit, not hunger. Not desperate anymore. Full. On a quiet morning in May, Samuel brought in 2 cedar planks and laid them on the table. "Found these up by the ridge," he said. "Figured they'd do for shelves." Clara touched the smooth edge of one. "You think about fixing this place up, don't you?" "I do," he said. "But only if you see yourself staying." She looked around, at the stove where a pot simmered, at the chair where her daughter sat sewing crooked lines with a borrowed needle, at the doorway where her boy leaned to listen to the rustle of animals in the barn. "I'm already staying," she said. They didn't speak of marriage. Not at first. It lived in the quiet between their gestures, in the way he poured her coffee first, or in how she folded his shirts without being asked. Love for them was not dramatic. It was built in daily tasks, in the trust of shared work, the warmth of 2 backs turned against the same wind. But one evening after the children were asleep and the house was filled with that particular stillness only safety can bring, Samuel reached into a drawer and pulled out a small box. Clara watched his hands. "My mother's," he said, voice almost unsure. "Passed it to me before she died. Said not to give it unless I meant it." He opened the box. Inside was a simple gold ring, worn thin but strong. "I mean it," he said. Clara didn't cry. She didn't need to. She reached out and took the ring with both hands, held it like something sacred. "I'll wear it," she said, "because I choose this life. And I choose you." The wedding was small, just the 4 of them, and the wind through the trees. Samuel carved 2 chairs for the porch that week, and Clara hung a curtain in the window above the table. By June, the garden had sprouted, the fence held, and the nights grew warm enough to sleep with the door open. The boy took to carving with Samuel's old pocket knife, and the girl planted flowers in tin cans along the steps. One morning, Clara leaned on the porch rail, a hand resting gently on her belly. The sun touched her face, and the land below stretched wide and golden. Samuel stepped beside her. "You all right?" She nodded. "I am now." He put a hand over hers. They didn't need to say it. A new life had already begun. Subscribe and stay where the fire still crackles.